SeaWorld is keeping a close eye on a killer whale blamed for killing a trainer.
What began as a flawless, crowd-pleasing performance changed in an instant. Trainer Sam Collins stood at the water's edge, guiding the orca he trusted most through a routine they had repeated countless times without incident. Then something broke the pattern. A subtle shift in the water, a moment of hesitation. Before anyone could react, the orca turned on him with brutal force. In front of hundreds of stunned spectators, applause collapsed into panic as the show descended into chaos. This is the horrifying last moments of Sam Collins. The pool at the edge of the show. The orca tank buzzed as the main show approached. Families pressed close to the glass, waiting for the performance to begin. Sam Collins stepped into position. He had been working with Orca for 11 years by the time he was assigned to Luna. He was considered one of the facility's most capable trainers, technically precise, calm under pressure, deeply attentive to what he called, in recorded internal performance reviews, the language of the animal. Luna was 12 years old, 21 feet long, and had been at the park since the age of 3. He had spent 3/4 of his life in captivity. In the wild, a male orca at 12 is still learning from animals older than any person alive. He ranges hundreds of miles with his natal pod. Here, his world had narrowed to schedules, signals, and repetition. Sam and Luna had performed together hundreds of times. The movements between them had become so rehearsed that they often looked automatic to audiences. Sam believed he could read him clearly, but on May 7th, everything went wrong. On the day of the incident, conditions inside the facility had degraded in ways that no single entry in the maintenance log would capture, but that the OSHA review would later piece together into a picture that, in retrospect, read as an accumulation of compounding risk. Staffing was reduced. One of the 2 primary trainers assigned to Luna's sessions had called out, leaving Sam to run the interaction with a trainee with fewer than 40 hours of poolside experience. A small environmental change was added. The pool temperature had dropped 3 degrees below Luna's behavioral baseline due to a chiller malfunction. Peer-reviewed research on captive cetacean thermoregulation consistently identifies pool temperature as a significant behavioral variable. Colder water correlates with elevated cortisol levels and reduced responsiveness to trained recall signals. 3 degrees does not sound like much. Combined with everything else present that afternoon, it was nothing. When the music started, the routine held. Luna broke the surface and launched into his first jump, and the crowd responded immediately. For a brief moment, everything looked stable again. Then it started to drift. The footage from the session shows Luna exhibiting what experienced marine mammal behaviorists, viewing it afterward, immediately identified as displacement activity. He stopped tracking the fish bucket with his eyes. He began logging, floating motionless at the surface with his eyes above the waterline, a behavior associated in field research with social tension and elevated stress arousal. He turned broadside to Sam 3 times in under 4 minutes. None of these matched the routine, but Sam did not stop the show and moved into the final segment anyway. He entered the water for the synchronized routine, the highlight of the performance. The music rose, and the trainer and orca moved side by side as they had done so many times before, but the spacing between them tightened. Luna began circling closer, controlling distance in a way that felt increasingly deliberate. Sam adjusted, tried to redirect, and tried to recover the pattern. The audience still cheered, unaware that the structure was slipping apart. Then everything collapsed at once. Luna cut across his path with sudden speed. His initial contact was lateral, displacing Sam sideways using his rostrum, the rounded anterior of the skull, pulling him below the surface. The trainee activated the emergency recall signal, which the park's safety documentation described as a reliable aversive deterrent and had been tested on Luna in formal training exactly 4 times in the preceding 3 years, but Luna did not respond. He held Sam under for 42 seconds before letting him go. What still looked like performance to the crowd had already turned into something else entirely. Sam tried to surface. Luna came back faster. The second contact was decisive. Jaws closed around his leg and dragged him downward with overwhelming force. The water broke into violent motion as control disappeared completely. Pain hit immediately, sharp, disorienting, total. Sam fought to stay composed, but nothing in his training prepared him for the reality unfolding around him. Every movement became resistance against pressure that did not give way. Only then did the audience realize that something had gone wrong. Sam's strength began to fade as orientation disappeared and pressure increased. Attempts to break free failed against Luna's control. The water turned chaotic, visibility collapsing into movement and force. On the platform, the intervention escalated. Staff tried to distract, redirect, or do anything to break focus. Ropes and surface disruptions were introduced. Every second stretched longer than it should have. Then, suddenly, the grip released. Sam drifted upward, uncontrolled. Divers entered immediately, but the timing had already passed. The trainee and 2 staff members extracted him within 90 seconds of the emergency signal. A response time the investigation noted fell within the park's acceptable range. Sam had a fractured collarbone, 2 cracked ribs, a severe forearm laceration, and a traumatic brain injury consistent with repeated submersion and oxygen deprivation. The aftermath moved quickly beyond the facility. News coverage framed it as a shocking accident. Public reaction shifted from disbelief to debate, and the question of captivity itself returned with force. Inside the park, there was no single explanation. What emerged instead was a chain of conditions, each familiar, each previously tolerated, none sufficient on its own but devastating together. Luna's history became central to later analysis. Captured young, raised in confinement, shaped entirely by an environment far removed from anything resembling the wild. Over time, researchers have linked such conditions to changes in stress response and behavior under pressure. Sam is not the first to meet a horrifying, untimely death like this. Years before his final moments, Orca entertainment had already turned deadly. In 1991 in Canada, a young woman slipped into a pool and never resurfaced. Sealand of the Pacific, the first warning. Sealand of the Pacific occupied a floating platform at the edge of Oak Bay Marina in Victoria, British Columbia. By any objective assessment, it was one of the worst facilities in the history of marine mammal captivity. Not as editorial opinion, but as the conclusion that emerges from reviewing the records, the pool dimensions, the behavioral incident logs, the staffing ratios, the documented social conditions, and the physical constraints placed on 3 orca who were held there for years before the morning of February 21, 1991. The 3 orcas, Tilikum, Haida II, and Nootka IV, lived in a pool that measured less than 100 feet at its longest dimension. Tilikum had been captured near Iceland in 1983 at approximately 2 years of age and transported to Sealand, where he occupied the lowest position in the social hierarchy. Haida II and Nootka IV were both older, both female, and both, according to trainer records, regularly raked and charged Tilikum, leaving visible scarring across his dorsal surface. The facility had no separation capability. There was nowhere for him to go. At night, the 3 orcas were confined to a floating security pen, a structure roughly 1/5 the size of the show pool, to prevent vandalism. They spent approximately 14 hours of every 24 hours in that pen. Researchers studying stereotypic behavior in captive cetaceans have identified this kind of severe spatial restriction as a primary driver of what the literature terms captive psychopathology, the development of repetitive, purposeless behaviors and persistently elevated stress hormones that do not normalize even when the animal is returned to its standard enclosure. Tilikum arrived at Sealand as a calf. He spent 8 years there, and the conditions he had been living in had been doing measurable neurological damage for nearly a decade. Kelty Byrne was 20 years old. She was a competitive swimmer, a biology student at the University of Victoria, and a part-time trainer at Sealand, where she had been employed for approximately 8 months. On the afternoon of February 21st, she was working a poolside training session when she slipped on the wet deck and fell into the show pool. What happened next was documented in testimony given to the BC coroner's inquest and reported by the Victoria Times columnist. Tilikum reached her first. He grabbed her foot and pulled her under. Haida and Nootka joined within seconds. For the next hour, the 3 orcas prevented Byrne from reaching the pool perimeter, pulling her under repeatedly whenever she surfaced. Staff threw life rings. They entered the water with rescue equipment. They tried to distract the animals with fish. Nothing worked. Byrne was submerged, held, released, and submerged again in a pool with no emergency drain, no rapid separation system, and no protocol for what to do when all 3 animals were simultaneously engaged with a human body. The coroner's inquest determined the cause of death as drowning. The injuries documented in the report were consistent with repeated forced submersion by large cetaceans. The BCSPCA conducted its own review. 2 months after Byrne's death, Sealand sold its 3 orcas to SeaWorld. Tilikum was sold for approximately $1 million. The sale was framed as a responsible response to the incident, a decision to relocate behaviorally complex animals to a better-equipped facility. What it was, stripped of the framing, was a transfer of liability. Sealand closed 3 months later. Its behaviorally damaged animals were now Florida's problem. And Florida did not know or did not ask what 8 years of those conditions had actually produced. The BC coroner's inquest issued several recommendations following Burns' death. Better pool design to allow animal separation, clearer emergency response protocols, and stricter trainer qualification standards. But the animal the system had produced did not disappear when Sealand closed. He was loaded onto a transport truck, driven to an airport, and flown to Orlando, where a company with far greater resources, far more sophisticated public relations, and no particular incentive to ask hard questions about what it was receiving, put him in a pool and added him to the show roster. SeaWorld logged his past in just 3 sentences and put him straight into the show. 8 years later, a man climbed a fence at SeaWorld Orlando and entered Tilikum's pool. By morning, he was found draped across the orca's back, and what the coroner discovered on that body was not consistent with a simple drowning. SeaWorld Orlando, the body in the pool. On the morning of July 6, 1999, a SeaWorld Orlando trainer arrived for the first session of the day and found a man's body draped across the back of Tilikum. The man was 27-year-old Daniel Dukes. He had purchased a single-day admission ticket the day before, hidden within the park after closing, removed his clothing at some point during the night, and entered the Orca pool. SeaWorld's official statement described the cause of death as hypothermia and drowning, with the additional notation that injuries were consistent with animal contact. That language, consistent with animal contact, is doing specific institutional work. It does not say Tilikum killed Daniel Dukes. It creates a sentence that is technically defensible while communicating as little as possible about the coroner's report. The coroner's report documented trauma to multiple areas of Dukes' body, consistent with the pressure and bite force of a large cetacean. The pool temperature at SeaWorld Orlando's Orca facility is maintained between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, cold incapacitation in an adult male with no thermal protection begins within 1 to 3 hours. He had been in the water all night. What the Dukes case forced into the record, at least briefly, was a question SeaWorld had strong institutional reasons to avoid. What were Tilikum's behavioral conditions at SeaWorld 8 years after his transfer from Sealand? The answer, had any investigative authority pressed for it, was not reassuring. By 1999, trainers were not permitted to enter the water with Tilikum. He was managed exclusively through what the industry calls dry work, hand signals, target training, and fish reinforcement from the pool deck. SeaWorld's own internal records, released through the OSHA litigation process following the 2010 Brancho incident, would later confirm that Tilikum's behavioral profile had been considered too unpredictable for in-water trainer contact for years. If Tilikum's behavioral profile was already sufficiently concerning that SeaWorld had removed trainers from his pool, then the follow-on questions become unavoidable. How was a single admission ticket and one overnight sufficient to give an untrained civilian access to that enclosure? What security measures surrounded a pool containing an animal that had already been present at one human death and whose behavioral record had prompted the restriction of professional access? The answers were not publicly pursued in 1999. SeaWorld reviewed its perimeter security, improved signage, and moved forward. Dukes was categorized in public discourse as a trespasser who made a fatal error. That framing is not false, but it is partial. The complete picture includes an institution that acquired a behaviorally compromised animal from a facility where that animal was present at a fatal incident, restricted professional trainer access to that animal's pool, and then failed to secure that pool against the public whose admission fees were funding the operation. Dukes made a catastrophic decision. The structure that made his decision fatal was not of his making. After 1999, Tilikum's status at SeaWorld grew more complicated, not less. He remained the facility's most reproductively significant male. More than 50% of SeaWorld's captive orca population is estimated to carry his genetic material, a concentration of reproductive investment in a single animal with a documented behavioral history that reflects the prioritization of business continuity over safety analysis. By 2009, Tilikum had been at SeaWorld for 17 years. He had been present at 2 human deaths. The show continued, and across the Atlantic, in a European facility running SeaWorld-style protocols, an orca born from Tilikum's line was already showing the warning signs. Nobody acted on what the behavioral record was saying, and on the night before Christmas, Alexis Martinez walked out to the pool. Loro Parque, Spain. The death they buried in the small print. On December 24, 2009, at Loro Parque in Tenerife in the Canary Islands, a 29-year-old trainer named Alexis Martinez was killed during a training session with an orca named Quito, Christmas Eve. The park was in the final preparation stretch for its holiday performance season. Trainers were working extended hours. The pressure to perform was elevated in exactly the way that anyone who has worked in a live entertainment operation during the holidays will immediately understand. Schedules compressed. Reviews imminent. No room for session cancellations. Quito was not a Sealand animal. He was not a direct product of the conditions that had shaped Tilikum. He had been born at SeaWorld Orlando in 1995, the son of Kalina, SeaWorld's first surviving captive-born orca, and Tilikum. He was transferred to Loro Parque in 2006 as part of a loan agreement between SeaWorld and the Canary Islands facility. Loro Parque was and remains one of the largest and most commercially successful marine animal parks in Europe. It had resources. It had credentialed professionals. Alexis Martinez was one of them. What the investigation of Martinez's death uncovered was a training culture that had the outward form of professional safety protocol and the inward reality of institutional pressure to compress the timeline between an animal's arrival and its deployment in public performance. Quito had a documented behavioral record showing escalating assertive interactions with trainers in the months before December 2009. Multiple incidents had been logged. The institutional response to each was a reinforcement adjustment, changing the reward structure to restore compliance rather than restricting in-water contact while the behavioral pattern was assessed. On December 24th, Martinez was in the water with Quito during what the park described as a routine training session. The attack was sudden and did not follow the warning sequence trainers are taught to identify. Quito struck Martinez with his rostrum with sufficient force to cause multiple internal injuries, then held him underwater. The injuries documented in the investigation included a fractured sternum, multiple rib fractures, a lacerated liver, and a punctured lung. His colleagues pulled him from the pool immediately. He did not survive. The Spanish investigation found that Quito's behavioral warning signs had been logged, but had not produced a restriction on in-water contact. It found that the training protocols at Loro Parque were directly derived from SeaWorld's methodology. It found that the holiday performance schedule had created conditions of elevated operational pressure, narrowing the gap between what the animal was demonstrating behaviorally and what the trainer was being asked to do. SeaWorld's initial response attempted to frame the Loro Parque incident as separate from its own operations. The OSHA investigation that followed Dawn Brancheau's death 62 days later would cite the Martinez case as part of a documented pattern and reject that framing directly. What SeaWorld could not explain away was the simple geometry of the situation. The methodology that killed Alexis Martinez on December 24th was SeaWorld's methodology. The animal had been bred and transferred by SeaWorld. The protocols had been developed and exported by SeaWorld. The geographic distance was 7,500 miles. The institutional distance was 0. Martinez's name appeared in almost no mainstream English-language reporting at the time. He was overshadowed 62 days later by a death at SeaWorld Orlando that would trigger a federal investigation, a congressional hearing, a global documentary, and the beginning of the end for the captive orca entertainment industry. SeaWorld Orlando. The day the system broke. Dawn. Brancheau was 40 years old on February 24, 2010. She had worked with Orca for over 15 years. She was a senior trainer at SeaWorld Orlando. By every account available, from colleagues, from the park's own performance records, from the audience who watched her that afternoon, she was among the most technically skilled marine mammal trainers in the world. She was meticulous about safety. She understood the animals she worked with at a depth that her colleagues described as intuitive. She had built a career inside the system, and she had made the system work for 15 years without it failing her in the way it failed her on February 24th. The Dine with Shamu show that afternoon was running late. Tilikum had already performed 2 sessions earlier in the day. His third session, the one that ended with Brancho's death, began with a relationship session, a low-stimulus interaction designed to reinforce the trainer-animal bond and assess behavioral readiness. Brancho lay on the pool's slide-out area and petted Tilikum. She scratched his rostrum. She fed him fish. By every standard of the interaction framework SeaWorld had developed, the session was calm, controlled, and within protocol. Then, Tilikum grabbed her by the ponytail. The incident lasted approximately 45 minutes from initial contact to the recovery of Brancho's body. The medical examiner's report documented fractures to the cervical vertebrae, avulsions, blunt force trauma across multiple body regions consistent with repeated high-velocity cetacean contact and the severing of her left arm. SeaWorld initially told the media that Tilikum had grabbed her by the hair. That framing did not survive the release of the medical examiner's findings. OSHA cited SeaWorld for a willful violation of the General Duty Clause of the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The term willful carries specific regulatory meaning. It does not mean SeaWorld intended harm. It means OSHA concluded that the company was aware of the hazard, the known behavioral history of Tilikum, the documented near-miss incidents involving other trainers, the pattern of behavioral flags in internal records, and failed to take reasonable steps to address it. The distinction between negligence and willfulness under OSHA is the presence of institutional knowledge. SeaWorld knew. OSHA concluded they knew, and the shows continued anyway. SeaWorld appealed the citation. The litigation produced a substantial volume of internal documentation, behavioral incident reports, risk assessments, training manual revision histories, and email chains between senior staff discussing the risk profile of the in-water trainer program after previous incidents. What the documents showed was a company that had been quietly aware, at the institutional level, that the in-water program carried risks that protocol adjustment could not fully address. The phrase that appears most consistently across those internal records, and that OSHA filings and depositions return to, is known foreseeable hazard. The company's own files contained the language of a system that its own data had warned, in advance, was capable of producing exactly what happened on February 24, 2010. One internal document in particular drew significant attention during the litigation. A risk assessment written years before the Brancho incident that explicitly identified Tilikum as an animal with elevated behavioral unpredictability and recommended ongoing restrictions on in-water contact. That document was in SeaWorld's files. It had been reviewed by people in positions of authority. Dawn Brancho, in all probability, never saw it. The trainer closest to the hazard was the one person the institution had the strongest operational incentive not to inform fully, because informing her fully would have required explaining why she was being asked to work in proximity to an animal whose risk profile stated she should not be in the water with. What SeaWorld revised after February 24th is worth noting in detail. It revised its trainer hairstyle policy, requiring all trainers with long hair to wear it secured close to the head. It enhanced poolside barriers. It increased the required distance between trainers and performing orcas during public shows. What it did not revise was the fundamental captivity model. It did not commission an independent behavioral health assessment of its orca population. It did not publicly acknowledge that the conditions under which its animals were kept were a causal factor in the incidents. The show changed shape. The system remained. The immediate institutional response was the suspension of all in-water orca trainer work across SeaWorld parks, the first time the company had done so. The policy was initially framed as temporary. It became permanent. Blackfish, released in 2013, placed the Brancho incident and Tilikum's documented history before a global audience that had not previously had access to behavioral records, internal memos, or the full incident sequence from Kelty Burn forward. The documentary triggered an advertiser exodus, a sustained decline in SeaWorld's stock value, and a years-long public reckoning with a captivity model that had been operating behind a wall of choreography and corporate communications for 40 years. Tilikum continued performing at SeaWorld until 2016, when he became visibly ill. He died in January 2017 of a bacterial lung infection. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos on screen for more stories that the official record tried to bury.